Hi, good afternoon. My name is Warren Epstein, a journalist and storyteller, and I want to welcome everybody to a literary discussion with Blake Bailey. This is part of the 5th annual Greenbox Arts Festival here in beautiful Green Mountain Falls, and it's also in conjunction with the Pikes Peak Library District. And I'm going to be one of the interviewers, or my co-interviewer beside me here is John Simons. He's a Colorado College professor who teaches film studies and English. He writes and teaches about Westerns and crime movies, and he's going to be a co-interviewer with me. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Warren. It's a delight to be here. I'm so happy to take part in this interview with Blake Bailey because one of my favorite classes and one of my favorite literary periods is the 1950s, an interest, a passion I believe that Blake shares with me as well. And to prove it, Blake's first two books, A Tragic Honesty, a biography of a relatively unknown American writer, known only to the so-called literati, but I think that reputation will spread in time, we hope, named Richard Yates. A Tragic Honesty is the subtitle of it. And Blake, for that book, Blake won the National Book Critics Circle.
I was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle
I'm
Award
sorry,
for that book. That's quite all right.
All right. I like his work so much. I'm elevating him to. He just won.
Well, just go on to Cheever, and then you can say.
And you won the Pulitzer.
He's got 3 books, and they all won the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont.
There you go.
The National Book Critics Circle finalist for the Yates book, followed by Cheever, A Life, a biography. Which won.
There
That's
you go.
right. Here we are. We're in the final turn here. Won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It's an extraordinary book and about an extraordinary man about whom we'll have plenty to say about his fiction as well as his life in a few moments. Most recently, Blake Bailey has published Further and Wilder. Is it Farther and Wilder? Farther and Wilder.
Yeah.
I'm reading that A now. The Lost Weekends and Literary Dreams of Charles Jackson. Now, many of you probably don't know who Charles Jackson is. Some of you, if you're old enough, may well remember the 1940s film by Billy Wilder, which I thought you were punning on in the title. It turns out to be one of Jackson's novels, titled The Lost Weekend, starring Ray Milland. Seeing this film as a kid was terrifying for me because I remember rats crawling out of holes in walls, and
Bats
and rats, and the DTs, and just the horrific life of Don Burnham over a 5-day period. It's also a remarkable novel as well as a remarkable film, and I think it's amazing that Blake has seized upon a writer who was seen as a kind of one-trick pony way back then. And it turns out that Charles Jackson was a better writer than that. And Blake has edited both The Lost Weekend and a collection of Charles Jackson's short stories, both of which are out now. I should mention also that he edited the Library of America collection of John Cheever's, I think it's 2 volumes, isn't it? John Cheever's novels and stories. So more about all of that later. And his current coup, he's on a roll, folks, is a biography. He's just been named the official biography of Philip Roth, who's been known to be quite prickly about people when they talk to him about his personal life. He has recently retired. He's a great admirer of Blake Bailey's literary biographies, and I think it's a wonderful tribute to Blake that Philip Roth, who was emerging from his cocoon as a writer, has not renounced is too strong a word, but has decided at age 80 he no longer wants to write, and he's opening up all of his records to this extraordinary writer, Blake Bailey. One last thing of a personal note, because it probably won't be brought up later on. Everybody has a John Cheever story, and the John Cheever story that the denizens of this area may be aware of. Some of you may remember the old Red Cloud Inn that goes up the pass toward Green Mountain Falls as being one of those old-fashioned restaurants where you had to wear a tie and a sport coat, etc. Well, John Cheever was brought there once by the eminent head of the Fountain Valley School, Lewis Perry. As they were getting out of their car, Cheever was already a little bit in his cups, and they were walking toward the restaurant.
What year was this?
It would have been in probably the 1950s, probably the 50s, because Lewis Perry died.
I mean, because if it's late 50s, by then Cheever was definitely handling.
Well, he was doing it.
Okay.
And he walked into a ditch. And he walked into the ditch, he rolled down, and he came walking out, cursing everyone in sight, and went straight into the restaurant demanding a martini. So this was a guy who had a will of steel when it came
That's my boy.
to those martinis. That was a wonderful story about him. Anyway, more about Cheever as we move along. But Blake, you'd like to say a few words now.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, John. I'm just happy to be here. We've been having a great time at the Green Box Arts Festival. I want to thank our magnanimous host, Christian Cassie, who is really the genius behind all these proceedings. And I came 3 years ago, and just in the 3
Did you see that
years
giant
since I
art
was
piece out
last
there?
here, Cloud City.
Cloud City is just
magnificent. It was on the roof of the Metropolitan Museum
Wow.
in New York, and it is heading to Chicago. Well,
It
and
looks best here.
it looks best here. It should stay here forever. So it's been fantastic, and it's great to be here with you guys in Outlook Lodge, which is just
Beautiful
gorgeous.
place.
All of this is wonderful. I do want to pick a small bone with what you said just then, John.
Some people just can't handle praise.
can't,
You know,
I
it's
know.
just,
You paint Richard Yates as this obscure, almost cultic figure. Yes, when I first took him on in 1999, my book was published about 4 years later. His books were out of print, and he was even Revolutionary Road was out of print. This is not the case anymore.
I
First
know
of all,
that.
a movie was made of Revolutionary Road in 2008 with Leo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet,
Yeah, who's heard
and
of that?
Revolutionary Road made #1 on the trade paperback bestseller
Yeah,
list
with
of
a
the New York
brilliant
Times.
introduction by
Okay,
Richard
so
Ford.
that's not obscure.
Oh, I knew
okay, it
that,
sold
but I
sold
guess
over
yes,
a million copies.
Right. During his life. it
Now,
wasn't
if
quite
you
like
want
that.
obscurity, Charles Jackson. Now that is one. We're talking obscure.
That's right.
Okay, he's totally forgotten. But you know, he was a lark to write about. Maybe we'll get back to
you know,
that.
one of
Yeah,
the things
Warren.
that I find interesting is your fascination with writers and the idea of writing about writers. It's almost like a songwriter who's just going to write songs about composer, or a painter who's just going to do portraits of painters. It seems, sort of odd on the surface, but there's obviously something about writers that just gets to the meat of what you're about.
Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of an accident that I became a literary biographer, and maybe I'll come to that in a moment. But yeah, writers aren't really public figures. They're private people, and if you're a writer of
Maybe
the first,
Stephen King, but
exactly. But I was about to eliminate Stephen King with my next statement, which is if you're a writer of the first rank,
There you
then
go.
you're not a public figure.
There you go.
If you're a best-selling amiable hack, then yes, you are a public figure.
Yes.
Anyway, so you're a private person, and you write about very intimate areas of the human condition, much of them involving terrible misery. Well, terrible misery fascinates me. And especially my first book was Richard Yates. Now, the way that happened was that I had been writing these unsuccessful novels. And my would-be agent said, Blake, this really isn't happening for you. And said, but you've done okay with nonfiction, so why don't you write me a proposal about some subject that really interests you right now? And what that happened to be was Richard Yates. Again, he was out of print. He was forgotten. I knew that his work was autobiographical. It had to be. I mean, where would he come up with this recurring figure of a alcoholic would-be sculptor mother who threw up on him as a kid and brought strange men in the place and blah, blah, blah. Just these agonizingly miserable stories. Well, I wanted to get to the bottom of that. Who was Richard Yates? How did he survive this terrible life? And as I learned more, just writing the proposal, it was fascinating. He was RFK's sole speechwriter at the height of the civil rights movement.
Yeah,
He
no
inspired a Seinfeld episode, okay?
Which
as
one?
did Cheever.
Even better.
wait,
As
I
did
know
Cheever. It's a motif in my work.
It's a
okay?
twofer.
I'm sorry.
so-
I'm sorry. We must stop. Which episode? And
The jacket. Elaine, who was based on Monica Yates, Yates's middle daughter, who dated Larry David in the 80s. Elaine's terrifying father is coming to town, and she says to Jerry and George, I need a buffer. You guys have got to come along. So they meet at the Algonquin, and Jerry's got this beautiful new suede jacket, okay? And the Yates character is Elaine's father, who is this wonderful but forgotten novelist and very gruff, alcoholic, gangster-like figure. You know, who talks like this, and who's the funny guy? And, you know, George points at Jerry and he said, I knew a funny guy in the Korean War. They blew his brains out over the Pacific. And so finally what happens is they're going out from the Algonquin to go to the restaurant. It's snowing outside. And Jerry reverses the lining on his suede jacket, and it's like this candy stripe line, just, you know, because suede will be ruined, and he's just dropped like $600 on his jacket. And the Yates character stops him at the door and says, one thing's for damn sure, you ain't going out with my daughter looking like that. And the jacket's ruined. That actually happened.
Wow.
With Richard Yates.
That's
and Larry
great.
So you asked, there it is.
there you go.
But long story short, you know, I mean, the more I learned about Richard Yates, he was bipolar. He was a pioneering guinea pig patient for psychotropic drugs. He was a colossal alcoholic. He led a Dostoevskianly squalid life.
Was he in the war?
Etc.
He'd been
Yes,
in the
he was
war,
a veteran
hadn't
of
he?
the war. Yeah.
And you wonder how many of these people were, you know, who were alcoholics, were self-medicating, of trying to
absolutely
figure out a way around their illness, and just, you know, that's a difficult route around. It doesn't really.
You know David Milch, the screenwriter and the producer, the guy who did
Hill Street Blues.
Hill Street Blues. He was a protege of Richard Yates. And while I was interviewing him, he started talking about his own drug addiction, his heroin addiction.
Oh, geez.
And he said, well, I'm bipolar. And he says, it's like a thermostat that's 40 degrees off. And you're constantly trying to get the thermostat down.
Exactly.
And that you know, was very helpful in understanding what Yates was going through.
One thing
He
you
was
write,
very self-medicated.
one thing you write brilliantly about too, Blake, is that when these people are in these total pits, these sloughs of despond, they seem to write better. Or especially Yates, the way you describe the cockroaches. I mean, it looked like the underground man's dwelling in Dostoevsky.
Thank you for bringing that up. You know, I think that misery is best recollected in tranquility, and I think Yates would agree with me. The thing about Yates is, when someone would go to his apartment, right, and they would see these gray curtains sagging with assimilated nicotine. He smoked 4 or 5 packs a day, even though he had emphysema, you know, had hacking cough. And they would see the semicircle of cockroach carcasses around his desk chair, because all day long he would swivel around in his chair, idly stamping cockroaches, trying to think of the next word to write down, etc. And it stunk, you know, you can imagine.
His students would come by, wouldn't they?
Students,
I
or
always-
his daughter Gina.
I
or
always
something.
wondered what the
He had
best
3
cure for
daughters.
writer's block. Roaches.
Roaches.
Right.
Yeah.
So they would come in there, and it would just be so foul and so oppressive and dark. He could only be bothered to keep one light bulb working, and when it went out, he'd turn up the stove burners.
Oh my
Okay,
God.
and this is a mentally ill, reclusive alcoholic person who's writing.
Yeah.
It was water off a duck's back to Yates. He didn't notice it. As long as the work was going well, and in that apartment that I just described on Beacon Street in Boston, it was going superbly
I
well.
gather the stories,
he
the
could
novels.
not have cared less. When Yates was miserable and at his worst was when the writing was going poorly.
Sure.
And that was bad.
Yeah.
You know, for yourself, looking at these subjects of writers, of John Cheever and Richard Yates and Charles Jackson, you know, it reminds me that when I've, as a journalist, had assignments to write profiles of people who are ordinary people, who are nice, you know, nice guys, nice women, they're the toughest to write about. Whereas people who are tortured, you get a little bit more meat there. I mean, has that been the case, and how does that apply to Philip Roth now, who doesn't quite
first
have
of all,
the demons?
I'll try and sort of work this around.
Except the
to,
anti-Semites.
First of all, I'm not at all interested in writing about, you know, the successful State Farm insurance agent who is married to the same woman for 60 years.
You really could be making so much money as a
dies in a nicely appointed
contract
ranch
worker
house in
for the
Peoria.
insurance.
That just doesn't really interest me. And I've had, you know, things written about myself, and I read it and I go, who is this guy? You know, because they make me out as this really sort of innocuous, nice guy, which I'm not. I'm a pain in the ass.
You have to get to that pain in the ass.
You got to get to the pain in the assness. Take Cheever, for example. One of the first people that I interviewed for my Cheever book was his paramour. I don't know of a better word, because he wasn't his partner, certainly, because, well, I'll tell you. Max Zimmer, who was a young man who was the love of Cheever's life for the last 5 years of his life. And in my predecessor's biography, Scott Donaldson's biography of Cheever, this is made to seem like a very idyllic relationship, okay? That this was Cheever coming to terms with his sexual identity, which has kind of tormented him all his life, and that it was his love was reciprocated by Max. His love was not reciprocated by Max. Max was a young man. Cheever was a very old man, and it was basically a casting couch arrangement. And Max was kind of playing along. And so
Liberace
Max told me
and his
about
partner.
this for.
Yeah.
Well, but even
Yeah.
Liberace's partner, you know,
Had
Max has been married 4 or 5 times, and at least fancies himself as straight. And so for 4 hours, Max sat there chain smoking and weeping, and telling me what a monster Cheever was and how exploited he felt, and this, that, and the other thing. It was a grim, grim story. And I repeat, this was one of the first people I interviewed. And I thought, oh, good. I get to spend 5 or 6 years writing about a monster, you know, because this was a terrible story. Well, over the course of time, you get all the evidence. Okay, I interviewed 150 plus people for Cheever. Some of them, in the case of Mary Cheever, the widow, I interviewed her 23 times alone. So you have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of various people's testimony. You have Cheever's 4,300-page single-space typed journal, one of the most famous specimens of that genre in American literature. You have 1 million letters, and so forth. And from that, you cull the evidence. And you see from Cheever's journal that he was terribly tormented about his relation, that it wasn't mean-spirited or exploitative, you know, that he was in love with Max. And so on. When you get the whole picture, it all comes out in the wash. To know all is to forgive all, and it's to write about a person, an exceedingly compartmentalized and complex person in the round.
So, I mean, monsters are fascinating, but it's
Monsters
even more,
are fascinating.
But it's even more interesting when you see that the monster had a heart and did so many wonderful things for people, and you have this multidimensional character to play with.
Right. I'm not Kitty Kelly. I'm not looking for the dirt. I'm looking for the extenuating stuff as much as I'm looking for the dirt.
Did Cheever have a way of transmuting that into his art, or did he?
Very much so,
wonderfully
yeah.
eccentric imagination, where the commonality of everyday life was always waiting for some sort of explosion or some entrance into it of the unreal, the unusual, the child who appears in your house at night, the airplane crash,
Right.
the man with the bare buttocks having sex with somebody in the hills outside of Rome or wherever it was,
Right.
who becomes a satyr figure in Cheever's imagination.
And ignites all these obscene
visions
thoughts
and
in
visions.
Bascom, the world of apples.
Right. Don't you think Asa Bascom is Aschenbach?
He is an Aschenbach character.
Sounds
yes,
like
absolutely. But arguably, all of Cheever's characters are Aschenbach.
Well, they
figures.
really are.
They're characters who
Temptation is a huge element in his
Of course, because what terrified Cheever, and this is what's being sublimated in his fiction, was exposure and disgrace of his own corruption.
Yeah.
He grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, where Morton erected his maypole, and the Puritans put down Morton and his followers, and so on. So he had Cheever he has an ancient Puritan lineage. So he had a very highly developed sense of sin and human corruption.
That's right.
So this is present in virtually all his work. There's always an objective correlative for sexual corruption in the earlier stories, because you couldn't write about it directly for the New Yorker, which was his primary fiction outlet for much of his career. So, for example, you have the housebreaker of Shady Hill.
Yeah.
Johnny Hake burglarizes his friend's house because he gets fired from his job and he's broke and he's got a family to support. And then suddenly, he senses that everyone is a liar and a thief, and
The world suddenly becomes an entirely corrupt
place. And Cheever wrote about in the journal. He wrote, "This by far, I'm terrified about the publication of this story because it's by far the most intimate, revealing story about myself I've written." And well, the layman coming to Cheever for the first time will read that and go, "What the hell is he talking about? Was he a burglar?" No, he was a closeted homosexual in the 50s in Eisenhower America, living in the suburbs of Westchester with a family, and he was terrified. Terrified
And
that he was going to
the
be found out.
closet at that point feels like that outsider burglar, whatever, you know.
Oh,
yeah.
He has to
It was
move
a
in
terrible
darkness.
secret.
He has to
He was
move in
terrified his
darkness.
family was going to find out about that.
That's right.
You know, and talking about the demons that you deal with in these authors, you know, Philip Roth seems like an odd man out in a way. I mean, and also the fact that you're a Goyim guy from the Midwest, and what the heck do you know about?
Right. What happened was I found out that my predecessor, Ross Miller, was fired. Okay, from the
I
job.
didn't know you were number two. That's,
you know, Roth
when you
is
have to
Roth
step
is
over a corpse to get
is
to
a
him, that's
notoriously
tough.
he's a delightful man and a funny man, as you might imagine.
Well, his writing is
but he's prickly. I don't think that he would object to my characterizing him that way. There was recently a PBS American Masters
saw that,
documentary
yeah.
about Roth, and the opening line we see Roth jadedly rubbing his face, and he says, he's 80 years old. He says, I have two things to look forward to, death and a biography. I pray the first comes first.
wow.
But
So I heard he got
I
rid
would
of
have said
this
dinner,
guy.
but I don't know.
I knew that he knew the Cheever book, if not the
okay.
Yates book, because he and Cheever were friends. They were, and I could go on about
Yeah.
that. But anyway, I wrote him a letter, and I said, I'm between projects. I just finished my Charles Jackson book. And he said, come to New York, and we'll talk. And so the first evening, I stopped by his apartment. We didn't come close to the topic of my writing his biography. He had a lady
you
friend
got in
come
the
over.
door.
I was in the
God's
that's it.
sakes.
I was in
a
the
miracle
door,
in
and he
itself.
wasn't even going to break. He was checking me out. Who was this guy? And so finally, I had to leave, and I said, "Well, where are we leaving this?" And he said, "Come back Saturday morning. I'll be here." So I come back, and he's alone. You know, before the cook, the lady friend, and the housekeeper was there. Now it's just Philip Roth. And I start to solicitously inquire about his back, because he recently had a back operation. And he said, you didn't come here to talk about my back. And he claps on these huge Swifty Lazar glasses and grabs this sheaf of paper, and he interviews me, you know, for the job. And the first question is, why should a Gentile from Oklahoma
Exactly.
write my biography? And I said, well, you know, I'm not a bisexual alcoholic with an ancient Puritan lineage either, but I wrote a pretty long book about John Cheever, you know, and we went on from there.
That's great.
And it went on for 3 hours.
Wow.
And he said things like, and it got tougher, and he would ask, and I'll leave it at this, but he said, what does Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud's work have to do with mine, and how do they all three fit into the course of Jewish American tradition?
Wow.
And, you know, I mean, tough ones
Those
like
are
that.
tough.
The good thing was that once I would start to answer, he would become fretful, you know, and he'd start answering for me and jumping in. And so he judged my performance by his, which was
Okay, you were
virtuosic, and he
doing
thought
his
I'd done a great
performance
job,
for him.
and he
Yeah.
hired me for the position. But getting back to your question, so no,
His
all,
demons are a bit
all
different.
three of they're different, exactly. All three of my previous subjects were colossal alcoholics, and in the case of Jackson, a drug addict. Philip Roth he's a nice Jewish boy from Newark, and he's never had a drinking problem, and he wouldn't go near drugs except the Vicodin he takes for his back, and even that he takes with a great deal of moderation.
But the man has issues.
But if you've read Portnoy's complaint, I
Right.
need not say another word.
Are you going
Conversion
to
of the Jews.
try to find out who the monkey was, or are you going to?
The monkey was a composite.
Okay.
Physically, she was one person, and psychologically, she was another.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
What do you got there
Oh
for
my
us?
God. I'd like to ask you, we've talked about this before a couple days ago, to say a few things. You've already described a little bit about your Oklahoma past. Tell us a little bit of your own story, because you have an autobiographical book coming out next year, right?
Yes.
So this could be kind of prelude.
I have finished
in March, is it?
after 11 years of sporadic
Yeah,
effort.
right,
You know,
right.
in between
Because
writing some.
I think if
hefty
you could
books.
talk a little bit about that, that will help us understand you as a man and as a literary biographer too.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to. It's called The Splendid Things We Planned. and it's about my family. It started out as mainly the story of my older brother who committed suicide and was a lifelong drug addict and alcoholic, and who made my family life, as you might imagine, pretty chaotic.
More than that.
But what was interesting and what made writing this book so difficult is I eventually had to face the fact that even if you took Scott out of the picture, it was a pretty eccentric family, and to put Scott into the picture was, I mean, how did I make it to the right? I'm going to turn 50 tomorrow,
Is it just
and I'm so happy to be turning 50. Here in Green Mountains Falls with my beloved friend.
Congratulations.
Is it just the two?
I don't know that this
just
is
you and
occasion
your
for
brother?
Congratulations. Otherwise,
Just you and your brother?
what?
Are there any other children?
Well, there were step siblings who
all right.
entered the picture
Gotcha.
at some point.
you-
Well, you should chuckle.
But it's it's funny when we think about our family dynamics and where we fit in. You ever watch The Munsters when you were a kid?
I did.
And I have this feeling that everybody thinks they're the Marilyn. They're the normal ones amidst this
Right.
whole family of monsters.
Well,
of course, they feel the same way about you.
Right. My father and I fancied ourselves the normal ones. And then there was my mother, who was kind of a person of legendary flamboyance in Oklahoma, who had a circle around her, kind of the local demi-monde. I may leave it at that.
They
For
were an
example,
arts crowd,
if there was
or
an
a-
interesting person visiting Oklahoma, say the actor Van Johnson,
They would
used to
stop
be
by to
an
see your mother.
MGM superstar actor, was with Humphrey Bogart in the Caine Mutiny and whatnot. If he was appearing in the local dinner theater in the 70s, he would, as a matter of course, come to our house.
Really?
Because all the
fascinating.
interesting artists and the charming gay men and whatnot were at our house.
Sure.
So that's where you went.
Wow.
So it's not all a grim story. It was a lot of fun. That was part of it too. But I met a lot of interesting people growing up, and I saw a lot of self-destructive behavior, not least in my own behavior and that of my family. Because when all was said or done, whoever was the Marilyn in my family, we all had some serious issues. And the person most like me in this world, he is no longer in this world, was my brother. And why did I go this way, and why did he go that way? And that's what I seek to answer.
And that's
in
what
that
you do in
memoir.
your writing, because these all three of these people have extraordinary demons.
Extraordinary demons,
they-
but they're ultimately in every case, stories of triumph and transcendence.
Tell us some more about Charles Jackson.
Charles Jackson,
Charlie Jackson.
That's a fascinating. The way that the origin of that book, Farther and Wilder, my biography of Charles Jackson, was Charles Jackson was not a major enough figure to support a book about himself. How could I even sell that? And the publisher was Knopf. How can you sell that at the University of Illinois Press?
Right.
And
question.
what I was going to do, I was going to write a series of profiles about literary failures. Because in my research on Cheever and Yeats, I'd encountered so many writers who were so promising and even prolific. Nathan Ashe, Flannery Lewis, Calvin Kentfield. You can't even Google them now.
I've never heard
It's
of
like
any
they
of
them.
never
I'm sure you-
existed. You can Google them, kind of, but their books, you can't pull them up on Alibris.
Wow.
Okay? It's that, and so I wanted to know how, what are the vicissitudes of literary fame.
yeah.
It just fascinated me. So, The Lost Weekend is a novel that I have cherished since college. I have this dog-eared 1963.
Well, it's great that you even discovered it, because most people
reprint.
just know the movie.
Most people only know the movie because the movie
Is
so
Ray Milland on that cover?
overshadowed.
Yeah.
The novel is a cultural artifact that is totally
that's
forgotten.
right.
But I had this reprint from the Time Reading Program series of the early 60s, and it was, contemporary classics that were relatively forgotten. And it has this editor's preface, okay? So this is 1963. Charlie Jackson is still alive, if forgotten. And it said, Charles Jackson used to deny that The Lost Weekend was autobiographical. In other words, he denied that he was this crypto-homosexual, hopeless alcoholic Don
Typecast.
Burnham. And it said in the prefaces, Charles Jackson, 20 hospitalizations later, has finally admitted he is indeed Don Burnham, but he's now sober, the father of 2 doting daughters, and the chairman of the Alcoholics Anonymous chapter in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And I thought, wow, now this is a redemptive fable.
Yeah. Yes.
And I said, I've got to include this in my little book of literary failures. So I Googled Charlie Jackson, and I found out that he died of a drug overdose at the Chelsea, where Sid and Nancy did their thing, in 1968, where he was living with this Czechoslovakian laborer named Stanley Zednik. And I went,
Where's my happy ending?
5 years after his vaunted chairmanship of the New Brunswick AA chapter, and this doting daughters in Rhoda, and he ends up as a drug overdose at the Chelsea Hotel 5 years. That's a story, man.
That is.
Yeah.
And then I found out there was just tons of papers languishing in the basement at the Dartmouth Special Collections Library. And so I wrote a 30-page proposal, gave it to my editor, Deb Garrison at Knopf, and I said, I know, it's Charlie Jackson. She was like, oh, Jesus, what? And I said, just read it.
Right.
And they loved it.
And I think
because it's a corking yarn.
You know, I'm fascinated by the mechanics of what you do. One of the things I'm curious about is it sometimes even more challenging when your subject is alive. And if your subject is alive,
Oh, it's infinitely more challenging when you're
and
subject is
if your
alive.
subject is alive, do you circle around them and do all these other interviews first, and then do because a lot of those stories, as you found, will lead you to things about this person that you wouldn't get in just a straight interview.
Right.
So how do you balance that? And you don't want them to feel also like ambushed, like. I'm just talking to everybody who hates you.
It is
and here's
a
what they say.
terrifyingly delicate balance, I have found.
Right.
Yeah. About 5 years ago, there was a story in the New York Times about is it wise to write biographies about living subjects because you can get in so much trouble. It is dicey enough.
There are lawyers
trying to write
waiting
about
for
there
that
are
book.
lawyers
Right.
waiting for you.
Yeah.
And writing about dead people. They have family. And
It used
you
to be
know,
considered,
heirs.
you
yeah.
can't libel a
Yeah.
dead person.
But you know, I mean, yeah, and
but
these
they
people
can-
want a particular version of their parents' life told.
Right.
You know, Monica Yates is a very formidable person, and she terrified me. She's Elaine from the Seinfeld show. So anyway, I was
she
interviewed
dance?
for that story in New York Times as being the spokesman for people who say absolutely not. You have to be off your chump to write about a living person. I mean, that is legally untenable. Virtually, to do a first-rate job, you can't.
Yeah, because otherwise
have
you're
to
going to
wait
just do
till
a
they're
puff.
dead.
You know,
And
you don't want to do a publicity piece that's
there is one exception that I was willing to make to that, and that is Philip Roth, our greatest living writer.
Yeah.
And so far so good. Philip is what he is he is a stickler for accuracy, and we have a legally binding agreement whereby he has to provide me with all the materials he has available, and he has to make himself available for interviews, and he has to encourage his friends and family to cooperate with me. And in exchange for that, he gets to vet my manuscript for factual accuracy, which I welcome.
Right. Oh, yeah,
I
of
want it
course.
to be as
Yes.
factually accurate as
but
possible.
not the
he
negotiation
cannot say,
of
Not
"You
your
know, I don't think I meant to
interpretations
say this.
or-
Let me change this quote a little bit.
No,
to-
he cannot do that, and he cannot affect interpretive content. So
Right.
if I say Roth's first wife was actually a charming woman and not the sociopath that he paints in the fiction, it is within my rights to say that. You
Yeah.
know, and he
Yeah.
cannot alter that. So again,
a fair balance,
So
I think.
far, so it is a fair balance, but it's dicey, and all I mean, there's going to be a lot of push and pull, and you've got to give the subject the correct impression in this case that his input is welcomed, but at the same time your autonomy is being respected.
And that at a fundamental level you care about them. And I think that was probably what the interview was about, as much as your knowledge of Jewish culture is, does this person care about me and the things I think are so important to get out to the world?
It absolutely gets us to the heart of it, and that was what Roth wanted to know, that I care deeply. His work, the survival of his work is so much more important than anything I have to say about his private life.
Right.
But as far as his private life is concerned, again, if I could show you my office right now, it looks like a psychotic hoarder lives there, because and my daughter, who's sitting over there,
Boxes and
it has
boxes of
boxes
stuff.
and boxes and boxes piled virtually
Are
to
these
the
letters?
ceiling.
Are these
and this is
journals?
the deal I have. It's memos he's written me
Okay.
that will take
All
me
right.
years to
My
get to,
God.
that are all in these files and boxes that he's arranged for me.
Are they
it's
memos
all his
about-
private papers.
Right.
It's his first wife's diary. I mean, I can do, and here's the deal we have. I can use these materials however I see fit, and when I am done, I have to relinquish them to the Library of Congress, where they will remain under seal to the public until 2050.
Even though you'll be
So
exposing
nobody
a lot.
has access to
Right.
Philip Roth's private
You're-
papers
you're the
except
man.
me.
You.
This
That's-
is truly...
And I'm curious about
Stay healthy.
You know,
Yeah.
as a writer, as a biographer of these authors, do you measure your own success not only in the sale of your work but in theirs and the
The
interest?
sale?
I know it's. I don't want to
My
sully
self-esteem
you.
is
I don't
about
wanna
to plunge
I don't want
here.
to sully
We
you
need
with
to
the
follow
idea
the-
that you're a
right,
writer
right.
who wants to make money, but the idea that of bringing interest to these other writers seems to be one of your goals and what motivates you.
Yeah, well, literary biography is...
It's where
let's face
it's
it,
where the money
it's
is.
where the money is. I followed the money. It is so unsexy. I mean, let's face it. Now, as far as doing one's bit, making one's cultural contribution, I feel I've done that. More in the case of my Yates book than in
Yeah,
any other
'cause
book.
you really
know,
made the contribution.
Here's what happened.
Yeah.
Yates was truly forgotten. He was the sad, obscure figure that John painted him as
Right.
in his introduction. Again, books out of print,
Yeah.
Richard Who, even Revolutionary Road, The Easter
I
Parade,
know.
11 Kinds of Love. These are the best books written in post-war
They're
American fiction, and they
fantastic.
are forgotten. It is terrifying that such work could be forgotten.
Yeah.
I wrote that
It even
biography.
seems like on IMDb his name is smaller than the rest.
And it's not that the biography per se made the bestseller list. It sold respectably for a literary biography, but the people who mattered took notice, brought books, brought Yates's books back into print. Picador reissued, all his backlist. Revolutionary Road got this vintage reprint with a great introduction by
wonderful.
Richard Ford. Revolutionary Road, the movie, got made, and now Richard Yates, he's back on top. We're close. Cheever,
That's a great
and you
accomplishment
talk about
for you.
sales. My Cheever book, the paperback says national bestseller. You cannot say that unless it technically qualifies. I made the top 10 in Boston, Washington, and San Francisco, and I made the extended bestseller
Yay.
list for the New York Times. For a literary biography, that's
fantastic.
pretty incredible.
And then the
kidding.
Cheever books were
but the
being
Cheever
sold.
books, that is
collection.
the paradox. The Cheever books. Again, and this is a
Even
man
the
who
collected
had an
stories
enormous
still
general
there.
readership.
Yeah.
Cheever's Faulkner was #1 in 1977 on the Times bestseller list. The Stories of John Cheever was on the bestseller list for 6 months, won the Pulitzer and every other prize. And Cheever's books, the sales are terrible. And they haven't gotten any appreciably any better.
You
as a
didn't
result
move the
of my
needle at all.
But my biography itself sold quite well because by now people are just what they want, the lurid story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And don't even get me started on Farther and Wilder, but we knew that was going to take a
Yeah,
bath.
that
But
would be a
you
tough
know,
one.
I mean, it was fun.
Yeah.
No regrets.
What Roth books do you find you like best? I have some
You know,
favorites.
it's interesting because whenever someone asks me, what should I read first? I always say Goodbye Columbus.
Oh, yeah. Start at the
Goodbye
beginning.
Columbus.
Oh, gosh.
You know, his first.
Another
That's a
great
wonderful-
adaptation
First book.
as well. I love the movie.
First
Yeah.
book of
Great
31 books. That was the first one, published when he was 26, won the National Book Award, and is absolutely delightful. The only movie made of a Roth book that is worth a tinker.
That's right.
Yeah.
Piss and
I love
it. Great movie, great book, and just lovely in every way about Jewish American life for second
yeah.
generation Jewish middle class
Wasn't that
life.
Richard-
A love story.
Richard
I mean, it just
Benjamin?
works.
No, what-
Yeah, it is
It was,
Benjamin.
Ollie McGraw.
And Ollie McGraw,
Look,
oh, gosh,
it's based
such a
on
Benjamin is
Roth's
Portnoy.
love affair
Yeah.
with this woman named Maxine Grofsky. And whenever I'm interviewing someone, and I said, "Well, what was Herman, the father, like?" This has happened 3 times. They say, "Well, did you see the movie Goodbye Columbus?" And I said, "Well, of course." And they said, Jack Klugman.
That's
Mr.
right.
Potemkin. And
That's
Goodbye Klugman.
exactly it.
That was Herman Grofstedt.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
absolutely.
What
in
an
the flesh.
intimidating character.
What an intimidating character.
Right.
The stogie chomping, going over the plumbing invoices.
Oh,
But
my God.
so now, if you tell Roth that you love Goodbye Columbus, that almost got me out of the job
Did it
right
really?
there, because he views
What?
it,
Of course, 'cause it
he
was his
views
first.
it as apprentice, shoddy work, and he says, I was such a piker in those days. I put lions in front of the Newark Library. There are no lions in front of the Newark Library. All I had to do was get on a bus and go stand in front of the library.
And I would
And I
tell
know there
you.
were. That's the kind of thing that just
man.
puts
Oh,
a
my God.
bug up his butt.
Is it really?
So he was.
That is
If he could disavow that book, but you can't be Philip Roth and disavow Goodbye Columbus.
No.
I love that book.
Yeah.
Okay, Portnoy's Complaint. It made him a rich man. It's made him a rich man to this day. He doesn't like that book. He doesn't like that book. So, of my favorites, I love Goodbye Columbus. I love Portnoy's Complaint. When She Is Good, his third novel, right
Yeah.
before Portnoy's Complaint, is all but forgotten. It shouldn't be. It's great. My Life as a Man, terrific. His best novel is the first Zuckerman book, The Ghostwriter. Okay,
wonderful book.
That
Oh, I haven't read
is
that one.
Oh my God!
wonderful.
It postulates that Anne Frank may be alive and living with this writer off in the woods somewhere.
Oh,
and
I
builds
love
With
it.
this Bernard
Malamud,
like
maybe a little bit
gosh.
of Bobble, a little bit of I Like Him Too. I mean, it is an
and
extraordinary
he
book.
puts her on his lap, and he's this bald, Jewish writer with
Yeah.
a fat painted tie, and he, but this masterly craftsman, with a Malamud-like reputation and a Salinger-like reclusive lifestyle, and Zuckerman hears this old Jew with this Anne Frank, lovely young girlfriend, singing Jimmy Durante to her.
It's really wonderful shtick, but it's very
Yeah,
effective.
it's a
Deeply
wonderful,
effective.
wonderful book.
One of the
long-
funniest,
so-
really one of the funniest writers. And
One of the funniest writers
and that's
ever.
here's one of the things I think would be challenging as his autobiographer, or as his biographer, is how do you get funny in your book? Because if I read that and if I don't laugh a few times, you're not doing your job, right?
I'm not Philip Roth. I'm not even a Jew. So that.
Oh, so
right
you don't
there-
really have the
But
funny gene.
I've
The
got-
funny gene is not
I've
there.
got
You've
great
got-
material.
you've got a funny
Believe
gene.
me, I've got great material. So it's going to work out.
My favorite is American Pastoral. I
American
love that book.
Pastoral is wonderful, and it's
About
definitely
the Newark
in my
background
top.
is so
The
wonderful.
Newark, the
My
glove
God,
factory,
how
the
you build,
Central
you
Avenue.
make those gloves.
Make those
I
up.
read that over and over again.
See, if you were to ask me what I think is the most impressive set piece in Roth's fiction, I would say the tour of the glove factory.
extraordinary.
How
in
evocative
American
that
history.
is.
You get to
It's
feel that
fantastic.
in the back of your neck when you think about
Right,
that.
and they have the cutters spinning
Yes,
on the leather,
yes,
and
yes.
I mean that's
the
fantastic.
famous dinner party that Zuckerman attends. I mean,
he
stuff
sticks
is
the fork in her-
Yes, the virtuoso writing is
There you go.
You
It's
know,
a great
and-
book.
a wonderful.
And when
book.
you're writing these biographies, I mean, obviously accuracy is so important, and it, you talk to 150 people, you do all sorts of fact checking. I'm curious about, we've had this wave of the resurgence of the memoir over the last decade, and to a fault, some really, really great work, some not so great work. And one of the things that some of the writers of memoirs have come out and say, well, it's not exactly literally accurate in every respect. When I was 12, I don't remember what happened on Tuesday, but I put together as best I could. And that seems to be an entirely different standard as a biographer of what you're doing. It has to have happened. It has to be that detail has to have been, it had to be that he was eating wheat toast at that moment. Is it a different standard for you now writing your memoir? Or has the idea of doing a biography, all these biographies sort of affected you of, no, I have to get every detail exact?
There are thousands of living witnesses to, the lives that are recounted in my biographies. And no one, except briefly Max Zimmer, and he recanted, has ever come forward and said, you lied here, or you got this wrong. Okay. Because, though I say it myself, and it's an immodest thing to say, but I think it's accurate, I am so exhaustive in my research. And I don't put in details that are fabricated. I mean, if I don't have some solid documentation for something, I leave it out. And that's my advice to all biographers. any biographers out there, if you don't have
So don't
solid
write-
evidence, leave it out.
Don't write about when you were 7 because you're not going to
make
get
stuff
it.
up. Okay, don't do that. That's the
Like a
cardinal
newspaper,
rule.
yeah.
That's the cardinal morality of writing biographies. Now, with a memoir, you are fictionalizing with every sentence you write.
Because it's seen through such
Okay,
a
every time you
a
write,
lens.
every time you write a line of dialogue, you are making it up.
Sure.
Okay. Now the point with memoir writing, and that's what makes it so tricky, is don't make it up on purpose. Okay. All subjectivity is a fabrication to some extent.
Right.
It's like Rashomon. You know,
Yeah.
the murder in the woods is witnessed by 4 different people. You have 4 wholly different stories.
That's right.
Point of view, subjectivity is fabrication.
You never know.
There you are. Let me give you an example. I was transcribing in my quarters here in Green Mountain Falls, across from Christian Cassie's lovely Victorian cottage. I was transcribing an interview with Philip Roth. Okay, and I still have hundreds of hours to go, but I remembered this very sticky point where where a friend of his told me something that is private, not private to him, but private to a friend of his. So he didn't, and he didn't want her to have told me this. So he asked me directly, and this is on tape. I'm listening to this. He asked me directly, "Did she tell you about so and so?" And I said, "Yes." And the way I remembered that, and this was only a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
The way I remembered that was that I was terrified and cornered, and I kind of tried to hedge and go, "Well, I'd rather not discuss blah blah blah." No, I cheerfully said yes. And I laughed about it, and he laughed about it, and it wasn't that fraught at all.
Yeah,
And I totally missed 2 months after the fact.
And you remember
I
it
totally
differently.
misremembered it. Okay, so what? And here I am writing dialogue about an episode with my brother, say, that happened 30 years ago.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
all I can say is that's how I genuinely remember it.
Yeah.
All I can say about the
Yes.
dialogue is it was characteristic of what we would have said in that situation, and again, it's how I remember
Well,
it.
you're a brilliant
and that's all you can
storyteller.
do.
Yeah. Let's talk about memory. These books are so huge. Do you have a prodigious memory? Or is
Yeah,
it,
that's
is it
gotta
the
be tough.
notes, or is it a combination of the two?
My wife would say no. My memory, if anything, is verging on dementia.
Selective memory, we'll call
Because
it.
my wife will tell me something 5 times over the course of a given day, and then I'll say, "So where are we going tonight, honey?" And she'll tell me for the 6th time.
But when you
I
put
have a
this
very
stuff
selective
together,
memory, in other words. But for I have it. Yes, I think I have very highly developed long-term memory. And the reason why I don't hire people to do my research, I don't hire people to
Yeah.
transcribe my interviews, is because when you transcribe thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of interviews, okay, and it wears grooves into your brain, okay, until this story, I mean, with Yeats, which I had to write faster than the other ones because I was on a shorter deadline, I dreamt about Yeats almost every night because he so permeated my consciousness that I could not break free of him even in sleep. Okay, so I can't get it wrong. I mean, it's like learning a language by full immersion in the culture and not being permitted to speak other languages and so on until finally your conscience is riddled with it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've been curious about biographies and biopics is that some people have fascinating lives, they've done great things, but often I'm left like, and I think it goes to the idea of how do you take this life and turn it and shape the theme, shape the idea with a beginning, middle, and end as a storyteller, and what if the life is not presenting you with that and it's the way it looks in the surface?
The lives of great men are not necessarily intrinsically interesting, and here's why. You take a Churchill. Churchill has had probably 20, 25 major biographers. Yeah. And William Manchester's is pretty good, and Churchill's own account of his life is pretty good. But most are pretty dull. It's sort of a laundry list of events that we're all familiar with.
And
It's
one of the
like-
most fascinating men
it's-
who ever
right,
ever
one of the
lived.
most fascinating men who ever lived. And it's like the Grand Canyon, okay? There's that wonderful scene in the Chevy Chase vacation movie, right? Where they've gone through all this tribulation and whatnot, and he finally comes to the Grand Canyon, and there it is, and he looks at it for a moment and goes, okay,
20 seconds.
And off they go.
After all
Because
they've been through.
now, if you were the first, Walker Percy wrote about this, if you were the first explorer who came dragging through the thickets covered with mud, and suddenly there's the Grand Canyon, and you're the first person to ever see it. I mean, you would have fainted before the majesty of it all. It would have,
You would have learned to paint
but
if
the
you'd never been a painter.
iconic
Yeah.
image of the Grand Canyon, as presented through millions of postcards and TV and blah blah blah, it regurgitates something. Our consciousness, it can't process it anymore. I mean, it's so what?
It's a visual cliche in a way.
For a biographer, the burden is not the outer life; it's the inner life. Have you read, of course, Chekhov's great story, "The Lady with the Lapdog"? Of
course.
Okay, there's that wonderful epiphany in that story where he has the affair with the woman in Yalta, I think.
It is Yalta.
And then he goes back to his tedious marriage and his, life of playing cards with his cronies and whatnot. And finally, he can't tolerate it anymore because, the emotional pitch of being involved with this person that he was meant for. Right. So he goes back to the little provincial town and he runs into her again. And they begin to have this affair. And he, the narrator says in this epiphanic, he says that he realized that everything that was important in his life happened on the inside. And everything that happened on the surface was false and hypocritical and empty. And from that moment on, whenever he met a person, he assumed that what he saw was false. And that everything that mattered was going on inside.
Okay, but how do you
great
take that?
way of putting it.
How do you take that stuff on the inside and know that you still have?
Well, with Cheever, you have a 4,300 page.
So you have a you have a theme. You sort of get to the not just the how of a person, but a why of a person. You get to that fundamental question of who they are. But does that suggest a beginning, middle, and end as a storyteller?
Absolutely, it was so inherent in just the lineaments of Cheever's story. That here is a person. First, you had the received version. Updike, Cheever's life was a redemptive fable.
Yeah.
Here is a man who almost drank himself to death, and then he was forgotten. In 1975, he had brain damage. He checked himself into Smithers Rehabilitation Center. He got sober. He never took a drink for the last 7 years of his life. He came to terms with his tormented sexuality. He took a lover. And his family accepted him, and he lived happily. And he wrote a bestseller, and he became our most beloved short story writer, died at the peak of his fame, and it's a happy ending. Okay, nothing could be more false. Nothing could be more false. And Updike should have known better.
Yeah.
Again, the Jacobian truth of it was that the surface life was successful, and the inside life was more tortured than ever. Okay,
and that was in the journals
what you basically do is you hold that received version up to the mirror, and there's the truth.
Right.
And you tell that in all its intricacy.
You're
and I knew the truth.
Sure.
I knew what Cheever had revealed and wanted eventually to be revealed through the right.
I think that's implicit in how beautifully you write about the swimmer. Nettie Merrill is sort of swimming through the seasons of his whole life.
That's the archetypal
summer,
Cheever
fall,
story.
winter. He enters the winter and he comes to this house that is boarded up and empty, and then the story ends. I think Cheever is a genius for the anti-climax because it becomes climactic.
It does.
It really does.
Because suddenly you realize in the very moment of reading it that it was inevitable.
It was all inevitable.
And it was always there.
That's right.
You just didn't know it because it was just, it's like a slowly developing photograph in the liquid. And then suddenly, that's it.
He starts out as the first Dutch sailors at the end of Gatsby, and it all ends at the end with this complete vacuum. It's so powerful.
This fresh green breast of the new
world. And that's what Nettie wants. The Lucinda River.
There you go.
A river of light.
The Lucinda River.
My God.
And the false story he had told about the legendary Nettie Merrill, it all comes undone.
Right.
As he travels over the course.
Exactly. And Burt Lancaster walking like a duck.
Walking like, and at the public pool and making him check between his toes.
I know.
The parvenus making fun of him
It's
and
just,
whatnot.
what a story.
What a story.
What a story. What a man. This has been wonderful. I don't know
This
if
has been
we're
a lot of fun.
Yeah, I want to, before we wrap it up, get how long you've been in town here?
Let's see here. I got in town on Thursday, I think. Today is Saturday. This is my third day.
You don't have much of it.
Is it Saturday or is it Sunday?
It's Sunday.
Oh,
Have you been able to
that's my wife. Is
form much of an
losing its
impression
marbles.
about our burb here? Or?
I love it. It's gorgeous. I mean, let's face it. It's not Monte Carlo. But if for natural beauty, you can't beat it, and for good company, you can't beat it.
You went out to Garden of the Gods.
And we actually have
we
people.
we were there today at the Garden of
she was
Gods.
telling
We have
me.
people like Chris bringing culture here to the. So it's not just the mountains. We got some culture.
Let me say that the night before last, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Kyle Dillingham, a fiddler, and simply one of, if not one of the most virtuosic musicians and personalities and souls I have ever seen. That was just terribly moving for me, and he was right here.
And that was part of
in
Green
Green
Box-
Mountain Falls.
part of
And
Green
as far
Box
as I'm,
Festival.
this is a person who deservedly has an international reputation, and that's what's happening right here in this little town.
Well,
in
and
Colorado.
I don't know if you know that we were this sort of Hamlet for the arts back in like the 20s and
I had no
through the
idea.
40s. All the best artists in the world would come here and congregate what was called at the time the Broadmoor Art Academy. So we had this thing, we had this vision, and I think that it's starting to come back, this idea
think
of
so.
we have the natural beauty. And what we need to develop is that cultural fabric that's really going to hold this together and be the reason why people want to come, other than just take a nice hike in the woods.
Well, you guys are well along in the process. And again, indispensable to this process is the philanthropy and the
Yes.
good taste of Christian
Let's
Cassie.
salute this man. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for enabling us to do this. It's wonderful.
And I want to say how it's been an honor to talk with both you guys and about how the library district has been fundamental to both this today and what's going on. One of the things that our library district does is this All Pikes Peak Reads. I don't know if you've heard about this, where we have one book. It was Chicago had done it, and we've really taken it and run with it. Where one theme, and we explore it through theater, through the arts, and everybody reads this book, and it's been so great in getting people picking up books again. Of course, now electronic books in some
Right.
cases.
Maybe it's too late.
Just don't get
but-
electrocuted.
Yeah, but I think it's really an amazing thing, and they're a part of bringing you here today.
Well, it's
We want
great.
you
It's
to
great
come
to be
back.
here, and it's been a lot of fun talking to you two guys. And let's do it again sometime.
And
Come
we
back
look
to
forward
come
your-
to Colorado College and bring your wife who wanted to come to Colorado.
Who wanted to
College.
come to Colorado College, but got better money from University of Chicago,
right.
Really?
where
Where I with my
There you
have
go.
another connection.
That's
so,
right.
And we look forward to
and
your
Philip
memoir.
Roth.
And
Philip
when
Roth
is your,
taught at the
and when is your
University
memoir
of
coming?
thank you. My memoir titled, this is plug alert here.
Yeah.
The Splendid Things We Planned is being published by Norton in March 2014.
I look forward
And
to
it's
reading
a
it.
lot, Chris, it's a lot thinner than my other
Okay.
books, so.
Well, I want to thank the other panelists and interviewer and everybody at home that's been listening. It's been our pleasure, and we look forward to the next literary discussion.
Right, a delight. Thank you
Right,
so
thanks a
much.
lot.
Thanks, Blake.